The first spray of cold water hit the dusty hood of Jake Morrison's 1987 Ford F-150, and he couldn't help but smile. Saturday mornings were sacred to him. Coffee in his favorite mug, classic rock drifting from his garage radio, and the ritual of washing his grandfather's old truck in the driveway of his modest suburban home. The burgundy paint gleamed despite its age, and Jake took pride in maintaining every inch of the vintage pickup that had been passed down to him 3 years ago. He was working the soap into a thick lather across the tailgate when the sharp click of designer heels on concrete announced trouble approaching. "Excuse me." The voice cut through his peaceful morning like nails on a chalkboard. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Jake straightened up, water dripping from his hands, and turned to face his neighbor from 2 houses down. Karen Hutchinson stood at the edge of his driveway, her arms crossed and her face twisted into the expression he'd come to know and dread. The look of someone who had appointed herself the unofficial sheriff of Maple Grove Lane. "Morning, Karen," Jake said, keeping his voice level. "Just washing my truck." On the street, Karen's voice pitched higher as if she caught him performing some unspeakable act. "Do you have any idea how much water you're wasting? And look at this mess." She gestured dramatically at the small rivulets of soapy water running down his driveway toward the storm drain. Jake followed her gaze, genuinely confused. The amount of water was minimal, certainly less than what flowed during a typical spring rain. "It's just a little runoff, Karen. I'm using biodegradable soap and a little runoff." Karen's perfectly manicured finger jabbed toward the water. "That soap is going straight into our storm drains, poisoning our local waterways. And the water waste in the middle of a drought is absolutely irresponsible." Jake bit back his first response. There hadn't been a drought warning in their area for over 2 years, and the waterways Karen was so concerned about consisted of a man-made retention pond at the end of their subdivision. But he'd learned that logic rarely worked with Karen Hutchinson. "Look, I'll make sure to." "Furthermore," Karen continued, her voice growing louder, "the water is running onto my property." She pointed toward her immaculate lawn, where Jake could see maybe 6 drops of soapy water had landed near her property line. "That's property damage, and I won't stand for it." A few neighbors had started to emerge from their houses, drawn by Karen's increasingly shrill tone. Mrs. Patterson from across the street pretended to check her mailbox while obviously eavesdropping. The Johnsons next door had paused their own yard work to watch the show. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, had never caused problems, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and even snowplowed several driveways during last winter's ice storm. But somehow, Karen had made it her mission to find fault with everything he did. "Karen, I'm washing my truck in my own driveway with my own water," Jake said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not breaking any laws or HOA rules." "Oh, aren't you?" Karen's eyes lit up with malicious glee. Section 4.7 of our Homeowners Association guidelines clearly states that residents must maintain their properties in a manner that doesn't negatively impact neighboring properties. This water runoff constitutes a clear violation. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the minimal water on the ground, crouching dramatically to capture every angle as if she were documenting a crime scene. "And Section 2.3 addresses noise ordinances," she continued, now photographing his truck and radio. "Excessive noise before 10 a.m. on weekends is prohibited." Jake glanced at his watch, 9:47 a.m. His radio was barely audible beyond his own property line. "Karen, you're being ridiculous. It's 3 minutes before 10, and my music isn't loud." "Rules are rules," she snapped. "Some of us actually care about property values and community standards." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Karen's own backyard was visible from his second-story window, and he'd seen the weekly parade of lawn service trucks, pool cleaners, and house cleaners that serviced her property. Her own SUV received professional detailing every Tuesday with industrial-grade equipment that used far more water than his simple bucket and hose. "If you don't stop this immediately," Karen continued, her voice carrying across the neighborhood, "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA. And don't think I won't document every drop of water that touches my property for potential legal action." Jake felt the familiar burn of anger rising in his chest. He tried to be reasonable, tried to be a good neighbor, but Karen's entitlement and hypocrisy were pushing him past his breaking point. Around the neighborhood, he could see other residents watching, some with sympathy, others with the uncomfortable expressions of people who'd rather not get involved. "You know what, Karen?" Jake said, his voice steady but loud enough for the gathering audience to hear. "I'm going to finish washing my truck in my driveway with my water, just like I do every Saturday morning." Karen's face flushed red, and for a moment, Jake thought she might actually explode with indignation. "We'll see about that," she shrieked, storming back toward her house. "This isn't over, Jake Morrison." As she disappeared into her perfectly manicured domain, Jake stood alone in his driveway, water still dripping from his hands, wondering how his peaceful Saturday morning had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. He had no idea that this confrontation was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything on Maple Grove Lane, starting with his grandfather's arrival the following weekend. By Monday morning, Karen Hutchinson had transformed her weekend indignation into a full-scale campaign. Jake discovered this when he found a certified letter from the Maple Grove Lane Homeowners Association waiting in his mailbox, along with copies of Karen's formal complaint complete with her dramatic crime scene photos. The complaint was 3 pages long and read like a legal brief. Karen had cited 17 different ADOA regulations that she claimed Jake's truck washing violated, ranging from excessive water usage to creation of unsanitary conditions to disturbance of neighborhood tranquility. She'd even managed to work in a clause about diminishment of collective property values through negligent maintenance practices. Jake shook his head as he read through Karen's creative interpretation of the rules. She'd somehow argued that washing his truck constituted a commercial vehicle maintenance operation because he worked as a mechanic despite the fact that his F-150 was clearly his personal vehicle and the washing was done on his own time with his own supplies. But Karen wasn't finished with paperwork warfare. Over the next few days, Jake noticed an unusual amount of activity around Karen's house. She seemed to be hosting a parade of neighbors, each visit punctuated by dramatic gestures toward Jake's property and animated conversations on her front porch. By Wednesday, the effects of Karen's networking became clear. Mrs. Peterson from across the street, who had always been friendly, suddenly avoided eye contact when Jake waved. The Hendersons from the corner house walked their dog on the opposite side of the street. Even the mailman seemed to hurry past Jake's house with uncomfortable efficiency. Karen had apparently spun a tale of environmental destruction and property damage that cast Jake as some sort of neighborhood menace. The woman had a gift for making mountains out of molehills, and she convinced half the street that Jake's Saturday morning truck washing was somehow threatening their way of life. The situation reached peak absurdity on Thursday evening when Jake found Karen standing in his front yard with a measuring tape and clipboard, documenting the exact path of water runoff from his driveway. She was wearing a hard hat, an actual construction hard hat, as if she were conducting a hazardous materials inspection. "Evening, Karen," Jake said, walking up from his mailbox. "What's with the helmet?" "Safety equipment," Karen replied without looking up from her clipboard. "I'm documenting potential slip hazards created by your reckless water usage. One never knows when litigation might be necessary." Jake watched in disbelief as she took photos of completely dry concrete and made notes about residual soap film that existed only in her imagination. Several neighbors had come out to witness this latest performance, and Jake could see them whispering among themselves. "You're standing in my yard, Karen." "Public right-of-way," she replied smugly, gesturing toward the strip of grass between the sidewalk and street. "I have every right to document safety hazards that affect the community." "That's not the public right-of-way. That's my lawn." Karen looked up from her clipboard, her face flushed with the fervor of someone who believed they were fighting a righteous crusade. "I'll stand wherever I need to stand to protect this neighborhood from your environmental negligence." The confrontation was interrupted by the rumble of a familiar engine. Jake turned to see his grandfather's pristine 1995 Buick LeSabre turning onto Maple Grove Lane, its chrome bumpers gleaming in the evening sun. Walter Morrison drove exactly the speed limit, signaled every turn, and parked with the precision of someone who'd been driving for over 50 years without a single accident. At 72, Walter Morrison was the kind of man who'd earned respect through decades of quiet competence. He worked 35 years at the local power plant, raised 4 children after his wife died young, and maintained a reputation as someone who minded his own business but wouldn't be pushed around when push came to shove. Jake felt a wave of relief as his grandfather climbed out of the Buick, moving with the careful dignity of a man who refused to let age make him fragile. Walter took in the scene. Karen with her hard hat and clipboard, the gathered neighbors, and Jake's obviously frustrated expression, with the calm assessment of someone who'd seen plenty of foolishness in his time. "Evening, Jake," Walter said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "What's all this commotion about?" Karen, apparently deciding that an audience was exactly what she needed, launched into her prepared speech about environmental destruction and property damage. She waved her clipboard dramatically and pointed at Jake's driveway as if it were the site of an oil spill. Walter listened patiently, his pale blue eyes never leaving Karen's face. He had the unsettling ability to make people feel like they were being carefully evaluated, and Jake could see Karen's confidence wavering under his steady gaze. "So you're saying," Walter said when Karen finally paused for breath, "that my grandson washing his truck in his own driveway is some kind of environmental disaster?" "Exactly," Karen exclaimed, apparently missing the skeptical tone in Walter's voice. Finally, someone who understands the seriousness of this situation. Walter nodded slowly, then walked over to examine Jake's driveway. He crouched down with surprising agility and ran his finger along the concrete, then stood and wiped his hands on his handkerchief. "How often do you wash your truck, Jake?" "Once a week, Grandpa, Saturday mornings." "Same truck I gave you?" "The one I washed in this same driveway for 20 years when I lived here?" "Yes, sir." Walter turned back to Karen, who was beginning to look less certain about her crusade. "Ma'am, I'm curious about something. That white SUV in your driveway, the one that's so clean it practically glows, how often does that get washed?" Karen's face went pale. That's completely different. That's professional service. They have proper equipment and professional service that uses about 50 gallons of water and industrial cleaners every Tuesday morning." Walter's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "Service that runs their wastewater right into the same storm drains you're so concerned about." Walter Morrison had always been a man who believed in gathering intelligence before taking action. During his 35 years at the power plant, he'd learned that the best way to solve problems was to understand them completely first. So while Karen retreated to her house that Thursday evening, muttering about generational disrespect and property rights, Walter began what he privately called his reconnaissance mission. The next morning, Walter parked his Buick at the neighborhood coffee shop 3 blocks away and walked back to Maple Grove Lane. At his age, he earned the invisibility that came with being a polite elderly gentleman. People saw him as harmless background, which made him the perfect observer. He started his investigation at 6:30 a.m., positioning himself on the bench at the small neighborhood park that offered a clear view of Karen's house. What he discovered over the next few hours was more revealing than he'd expected. Karen's morning routine was a symphony of hypocrisy. At 7 a.m. sharp, her automatic sprinkler system activated, sending geysers of water across her lawn for a full 30 minutes, far longer than necessary and clearly violating the city's water conservation guidelines that recommended 15-minute intervals. Walter timed it carefully, noting that several sprinkler heads were misaligned and shooting water directly onto the sidewalk and street. At 8:15 a.m., Karen's housekeeper arrived and immediately began hosing down the entire back patio. Walter could see the water streaming through the fence slats and running directly toward the storm drain that Karen claimed to be so concerned about protecting. But the real revelation came at 9 a.m. when the pool maintenance truck arrived. Walter watched as 2 workers spent over an hour draining, cleaning, and refilling Karen's hot tub, sending hundreds of gallons of chemically treated water straight into the storm drains. The same storm drains that Karen insisted were being poisoned by Jake's biodegradable soap. Walter made careful notes in the small notebook he always carried, documenting times, water usage, and the various service vehicles that came and went from Karen's property. By noon, he witnessed enough water waste to supply Jake's truck washing for an entire year. But Walter's investigation wasn't limited to environmental hypocrisy. Over the weekend, he made it his business to chat with other neighbors, using the natural curiosity that people had about meeting Jake's grandfather as an opening to learn about the neighborhood dynamics. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of Karen's behavior patterns. Mrs. Chen from the end of the street quietly confided that Karen had filed complaints about her small vegetable garden, claiming it attracted vermin and lowered property values. The Williamses had been harassed about their teenage son's basketball hoop, with Karen insisting that the sound of bouncing balls constituted a noise violation. Even elderly Mr. Rodriguez had been targeted for having his grandson's car parked in his driveway for more than the HOA's arbitrary 48-hour limit for visitor parking. "She's been doing this for 3 years," Mrs. Chen whispered during their conversation at the mailbox. "Ever since she moved in, she's found something wrong with almost every house on the street. Most people just give in because it's easier than fighting her." Walter also learned about Karen's selective enforcement of rules. While she demanded strict adherence to HOA guidelines from everyone else, her own violations were numerous and blatant. Her fence exceeded the height limit by 6 inches. She'd installed decorative lighting without architectural approval. Her weekly parties regularly violated noise ordinances, but somehow those never resulted in complaints to the HOA. The most revealing conversation came from Tom Bradley, who lived directly next to Karen. Tom was a soft-spoken accountant who'd been quietly enduring Karen's harassment for 2 years. "She threatened to sue me over my dog," Tom explained, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood in his backyard. "Buster is 8 years old, arthritic, and sleeps 16 hours a day. But she claimed he was aggressively barking and demanded I get rid of him or face legal action." "What did you do?" Walter asked. "I installed a security camera system," Tom said, pointing to several discrete cameras mounted around his property. "Best investment I ever made. Turns out Karen was throwing rocks at my fence to make Buster bark, then recording him barking as evidence of the noise problem." Walter felt the familiar anger building in his chest, the same righteous indignation he felt 40 years ago. when he caught his supervisor at the plant trying to blame safety violations on younger workers to protect his own job. Bullies, he learned, rarely limited themselves to one victim or one method of intimidation. "Do you still have those recordings?" Walter asked. Tom's eyes lit up with the first spark of hope Walter had seen from any of the neighbors. Every single incident. 3 months' worth of footage showing her throwing things at my fence, then recording Buster's natural response. On Sunday afternoon, Walter expanded his investigation to include Karen's public behavior. He followed her to the grocery store, the pharmacy, and her yoga class, always maintaining a respectful distance, but observing how she interacted with service workers and other customers. The pattern was consistent and ugly. Karen berated a teenage cashier over a coupon policy, demanded to speak to a manager about parking space assignments, and loudly complained about other yoga class participants to the instructor. She moved through the world with an air of entitlement that suggested she'd never been meaningfully challenged or held accountable for her behavior. But Walter's most important discovery came on Sunday evening when he witnessed Karen's interaction with the Johnsons' 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The little girl had been riding her bicycle on the sidewalk when she accidentally dropped her water bottle, which rolled toward Karen's driveway. Walter watched from his car as Karen stormed out of her house and began screaming at the child about trespassing and property damage. Emma burst into tears and ran home, leaving her water bottle behind. Karen picked up the bottle and threw it into her garbage can with vindictive satisfaction. That was the moment Walter Morrison decided that Karen Hutchinson's reign of terror on Maple Grove Lane was going to end. He'd spent 3 days documenting her hypocrisy, her bullying, and her systematic harassment of an entire neighborhood. He'd seen enough patterns to understand that Karen wasn't just unreasonable. She was a predator who targeted anyone she perceived as unable or unwilling to fight back. Walter had dealt with predators before, during the war, in the workplace, and in various community situations throughout his long life. He'd learned that bullies rarely responded to reason or appeals to fairness. They understood only one language: consequences. As he drove home that evening, Walter was already formulating his plan. It would be elegant, educational, and perfectly legal. Most importantly, it would give Karen a taste of her own medicine, while demonstrating to the entire neighborhood that bullies could be defeated if someone was willing to stand up to them. Karen Hutchinson thought she was untouchable because she'd intimidated everyone around her into submission. She was about to learn that Walter Morrison hadn't spent 7 decades on this earth just to watch some entitled harpy terrorize his grandson and an entire neighborhood. The old man smiled as he pulled into Jake's driveway. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones that came with a little bit of poetic justice attached, and Walter Morrison was about to deliver a masterclass in both. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Walter Morrison feel 20 years younger. He'd spent Monday evening making his final preparations, and now everything was in place for what he privately called Operation Clean Sweep. At precisely 9:15 a.m., Walter watched from Jake's kitchen window as Karen's pristine white Escalade pulled out of her driveway right on schedule. She was heading to her weekly yoga class, a routine as predictable as sunrise according to his 3 days of observation. The yoga studio was across town, and Karen never returned before 11:30 a.m. Walter had exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. He walked to his Buick and opened the trunk, revealing the equipment he'd borrowed from his friend Eddie's pressure washing business. Eddie owed Walter a favor from 40 years ago when Walter had helped him avoid getting fired for a safety violation that wasn't his fault. Some debts, Walter believed, were worth collecting at just the right moment. The commercial-grade pressure washer was a beast, a 4,000 psi unit designed for cleaning construction equipment and building exteriors. Walter had also procured professional-grade automotive soap, tire shine, and window cleaner. If Karen wanted to complain about proper cleaning equipment and techniques, he was going to give her a demonstration she'd never forget. Walter wheeled the pressure washer across the street, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man executing a carefully planned mission. Several neighbors had noticed the activity and were beginning to gather. Mrs. Chen pretending to tend her garden, Tom Bradley washing his own car with obvious excitement, and even the Johnson children pressing their faces against their living room window. The beauty of Walter's plan was its perfect legal defensibility. He wasn't trespassing. Karen's SUV was parked in her driveway, which was clearly visible from the public street. He wasn't damaging anything. He was cleaning her vehicle with professional equipment and biodegradable products. Most importantly, he was providing exactly the kind of proper cleaning service that Karen had claimed was so superior to Jake's bucket and hose method. Walter began with the wheels, using the pressure washer to blast away every speck of dirt and brake dust. The high-powered spray removed grime that Karen probably didn't even know existed, revealing chrome that gleamed like mirrors. He worked methodically, the way he approached every job in his life, thoroughly, professionally, and with absolute attention to detail. The soap application came next. Walter covered every inch of the Escalade with thick, luxurious foam, using more soap in 10 minutes than Jake used in a month of truck washing. The excess suds flowed down Karen's driveway in thick rivers, creating exactly the kind of environmental hazard she'd accused Jake of producing, except multiplied by about 50. Mrs. Chen abandoned all pretense of gardening and walked over to watch. "Walter, what on earth are you doing?" "Community service," Walter replied calmly, adjusting the pressure settings. "Our neighbor Karen has been very concerned about proper vehicle cleaning techniques. Thought I'd show her what professional-grade equipment can accomplish." Tom Bradley joined them, barely containing his glee. "She's going to lose her mind when she sees this." "Why would she be upset?" Walter asked innocently. "I'm using exactly the kind of professional methods she's been advocating. Proper equipment, high-quality products, thorough technique. She should be thrilled to see such environmental consciousness in action." The rinse cycle was spectacular. Walter systematically removed every trace of soap with precision that would have made a professional detailer weep with envy. Water cascaded off the SUV in sheets, running down Karen's driveway and across her precious lawn in torrents that made Jake's minimal runoff look like a few dropped raindrops. But Walter wasn't finished. He pulled out the tire shine and began treating each wheel, making the rubber gleam like black mirrors. Then came the window cleaner, applied with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades maintaining equipment that had to function perfectly or people could die. By the time Walter moved on to interior cleaning, he'd noticed Karen's windows were down about an inch, perfect for accessing the dashboard and door panels. A small crowd had gathered. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that something unprecedented was happening on Maple Grove Lane. The Hendersons emerged from their house, coffee cups in hand. The Rodriguez family positioned themselves on their front porch for a better view. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd been avoiding Jake since Karen's campaign began, was openly staring from across the street. "Walter," Jake said, jogging over from his house where he'd been watching with growing amazement, "what are you doing?" "Demonstrating proper vehicle maintenance techniques," Walter replied, now applying a protective wax coating to Karen's hood. "Your neighbor has been very educational about the importance of professional standards. Thought I'd put her lessons into practice." The crowd was growing larger, and Walter could see cell phones coming out as neighbors began documenting the spectacle. This was exactly what he hoped for, maximum visibility for Karen's upcoming reaction. At 11:20 a.m., Walter applied the final touches. He used a professional-grade chamois to remove every water spot, ensuring that Karen's SUV was cleaner than it had ever been in its entire existence. The vehicle practically glowed, its white paint reflecting the autumn sun like fresh snow. Walter packed up his equipment with the same methodical care he used in the cleaning process. Everything was loaded back into his trunk just as Karen's Escalade, the original one, not the gleaming masterpiece in her driveway, turned onto Maple Grove Lane. The timing was perfect. Karen pulled up to find nearly a dozen neighbors standing in the street, all staring at her house with expressions ranging from amusement to barely contained laughter. Her SUV sat in her driveway looking like it had just rolled off a showroom floor, surrounded by puddles of soapy water that made Jake's weekly runoff look absolutely microscopic. Walter positioned himself casually next to his Buick, his hands clean and his expression serene. He looked like nothing more than a pleasant elderly gentleman who'd been enjoying a morning chat with the neighbors. Karen climbed out of her vehicle slowly, her yoga mat clutched in one hand, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, explosive rage. "What did you do to my sire?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "I cleaned it," Walter replied calmly. "Use professional equipment and biodegradable products, just like you've been recommending. Thought you'd appreciate seeing proper environmental stewardship in action." Karen's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. She looked at her gleaming SUV, then at the soapy water covering her driveway, then at the crowd of neighbors who were making no effort to hide their entertainment. You can't do it. This is vandalism." "Vandalism?" Walter's voice carried just the right note of confused innocence. "Ma'am, I spent 2 hours making your vehicle cleaner than it's ever been. Use the exact same type of professional service you get every Tuesday, except I did it for free." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Several neighbors were now openly smiling, and Walter could see that the dynamic on Maple Grove Lane was shifting in real time. Karen seemed to realize that her usual tactics weren't going to work with this audience. She looked around desperately, searching for support that simply wasn't there. For the first time since she moved to the neighborhood, Karen Hutchinson found herself facing a situation where she wasn't in control. This is harassment," she sputtered, but even she seemed to realize how ridiculous that sounded when applied to someone who just provided her with a free professional car wash. Walter smiled, the gentle smile of a man who just played his hand perfectly. The standoff lasted exactly 37 seconds. Karen stood in her flooded driveway, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while Walter maintained his expression of helpful concern. The assembled neighbors watched with the fascination of people witnessing a long overdue comeuppance. Finally, Karen found her voice. "I'm calling the police. This is property destruction." "Ma'am," Walter said gently, "I'd be happy to wait while you call the authorities. I'm sure they'll be very interested in comparing the amount of water I use today with the amount your professional car service uses every Tuesday. And I documented everything very carefully." He pulled out his phone and showed Karen the photos he'd taken during the cleaning process, timestamps showing the duration, images of the professional equipment, and before and after shots that clearly demonstrated improvement rather than damage. "I also took the liberty of measuring the water runoff," Walter continued conversationally. "Approximately 43 gallons reached the street, which is substantially less than the 67 gallons that flowed from your property last Tuesday during your regular service. I have photos of that too, if you'd like to see them." Karen's face went ashen. For the first time in 3 years, someone had out-documented her, out-prepared her, and turned her own tactics against her. The crowd was growing larger as more neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of Karen Hutchinson at a loss for words. "Furthermore," Walter said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I prepared a small presentation that might interest everyone." He pulled out a manila folder and opened it to reveal a comprehensive dossier of Karen's activities. "Mrs. Chen, I believe you'll find these photos of Mrs. Hutchinson's sprinkler violations particularly relevant to your water conservation concerns. And Mr. Bradley, here are the timestamps showing when your neighbor deliberately provoked your dog to create false noise complaints." Tom Bradley's eyes widened as Walter handed him printed screenshots from the security footage they'd discussed. The images clearly showed Karen throwing objects at Tom's fence, followed by timestamp recordings of the resulting barking. "Mrs. Henderson," Walter continued, "I documented 17 separate instances where Mrs. Hutchinson violated the same noise ordinances she's used to harass your family, including last Friday's party that ran until 11:47 p.m. The crowd was murmuring now, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Walter had done more than just wash Karen's car. He'd systematically gathered evidence of every hypocritical act, every double standard, every instance where Karen had demanded from others what she refused to provide herself. "This is ridiculous," Karen sputtered, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "You can't just spy on people and document behavior that occurs in public view." Walter interrupted mildly. "I believe that's exactly what you've been doing to my grandson and everyone else in this neighborhood. I simply applied your own methods more thoroughly." Jake stepped forward, finally understanding the full scope of his grandfather's strategy. "Karen, maybe we should talk about this reasonably. All I want to do is wash my truck once a week, in my own driveway, with my own water. And all I want," said Mrs. Chen, stepping out of the crowd, "is to grow vegetables in my backyard without being harassed about imaginary pest problems. And I want my 8-year-old daughter to ride her bicycle without being screamed at for existing," added Mrs. Johnson, her voice tight with years of suppressed anger. One by one, the neighbors began speaking up. Stories poured out, 3 years of intimidation, harassment, and selective rule enforcement that had terrorized an entire street. Walter's documentation had given them something they'd never had before, proof that Karen's complaints were not only hypocritical, but systematically unfair. Karen looked around desperately, searching for allies who simply weren't there. Her reign of terror had been built on isolation, picking off neighbors one by one, making each person feel like they were the only target. Now faced with collective resistance, her power evaporated like morning mist. I was just trying to maintain property values," Karen said weakly, her voice barely audible, "by bullying children and elderly dog owners." Walter's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "By filing false complaints and selectively enforcing rules? That's not community stewardship, ma'am. That's tyranny on a very small scale." The crowd fell silent as Walter's words sank in. He'd articulated what everyone had felt but hadn't been able to express, that Karen's behavior wasn't about rules or property values. It was about power and control. "Here's what's going to happen," Walter continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to solving problems. "My grandson is going to continue washing his truck every Saturday morning, using reasonable amounts of water and biodegradable soap. Mrs. Chen is going to tend her garden. The Henderson boy is going to play basketball. Mr. Bradley's elderly dog is going to bark occasionally, as dogs do." He looked directly at Karen. "And you're going to stop filing frivolous complaints, stop harassing your neighbors, and start following the same rules you demand from everyone else. Because if you don't, I'll be happy to provide the HOA with documentation of every violation you've committed over the past 3 years. You can't threaten me, Karen said, but her voice was hollow. I'm not threatening anyone, Walter replied calmly. I'm simply explaining the natural consequences of behavior. You spent 3 years teaching this neighborhood about accountability. Consider this your final exam. Karen looked around one more time, seeing nothing but determined faces where she'd once found fearful compliance. Her SUV gleamed behind her like a monument to her own hypocrisy, surrounded by evidence of the very water waste she used to torment Jake. Without another word, Karen turned and walked into her house, closing the door with considerably less force than her usual dramatic exits. The crowd watched her go, then turned to Walter with expressions of amazement and gratitude. How did you know all this would work? Jake asked his grandfather. Walter smiled and patted Jake's shoulder. 72 years of dealing with bullies, son. They all have the same weakness. They can dish it out, but they can't take it. The moment someone stands up to them with better preparation and more patience, they fold like a cheap lawn chair. Over the following weeks, the transformation of Maple Grove Lane was remarkable. Karen's complaints to the HOA stopped entirely. Her weekly parties became quieter and shorter. She avoided eye contact with neighbors and kept to herself with an almost religious dedication. Jake continued his Saturday morning truck washing ritual, but now it had become a neighborhood social event. Tom Bradley often brought his coffee over to chat. Mrs. Chen shared vegetables from her thriving garden. The Henderson children played basketball with enthusiasm that echoed throughout the street. Most importantly, the neighbors had learned that bullies could be defeated, but only when decent people stood together. Walter had shown them that sometimes the best way to handle an unreasonable person was with superior reasoning, better documentation, and the courage to call them out publicly. 3 months later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's front yard. Whether she decided to leave on her own or been encouraged by the new neighborhood dynamic, no one asked. The important thing was that Maple Grove Lane had reclaimed its sense of community. Jake still washed his truck every Saturday morning, using the same bucket and hose that had started the whole conflict. But now he did it with the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting, especially when you had the right allies and the wisdom to choose your moment carefully. Walter Morrison had taught his grandson, and an entire neighborhood, that standing up to bullies wasn't about matching their aggression. It was about being better prepared, more patient, and absolutely relentless in your pursuit of fairness. And sometimes it was about knowing exactly when to break out the